Are you struggling to balance your modern life and your faith? You're in the right place. Welcome to the Legacy Dads Podcast with Lance and Dante, offering biblical-based wisdom and that weekly dose of what truly works in men's lives. The Legacy Dads Podcast, real men, authentic faith. Here are your hosts of the Legacy Dads Podcast. They're authentic, transparent, and not always politically correct. Lance and Dante.
Hey guys, welcome to Legacy Dads. My name is Lance, and I'm joined with my partner, Dante. What's up, my brother?
I'm living the dream, buddy.
Yeah, so...
one COVID case at a time.
One COVID case at a time. So guys, we're catching up. This is part 2 of a podcast that we're doing called How to Fix America. If you didn't catch part 1, we kind of laid out some of the issues we're seeing, and it's really people buying into false narratives and false premises. And I think, Dante, too, I also think it's I don't know if it's like a lack of people's like I hear people saying like I'm relearning history for the first time, and I'm like, I made a comment on one of the posts you made on Facebook, and I said, did you not know that this country was founded with slavery? This was an issue since the founding fathers actually discussed this as how do we deal with this when we found the country, and did we put this into the Constitution? So they were discussing this even when the country was formed, and they kicked the can down the road. And I was like, did you not know that this is a part of our history, and that we had this big thing called a Civil War that was actually killed more Americans than any other war because of slavery and racism? And then we had a bunch of racist laws on the book that led to the civil rights movement. And I'm like, do people, you didn't learn that history in college or high school or elementary school? I learned that in every stage of my life, but it's like people somehow they're acting like they didn't know this. But anyways, I'm getting on my soapbox again. So anyways, Legacy Dads, your weekly dose of biblical manhood. This podcast is for men, husband, and fathers at all stages of life. We promote and advocate proven biblical principles for leaving a lasting legacy. So, yeah, it's frustrating, Dante. And so I think there's this narrative being pushed that that people are buying into, and I see it in the church even, where, and I get it. Hey, if you don't like Trump, that's totally your right. But don't try to somehow biblical or theologize your politics. And then say that, well, I'm on the side of biblical truth now because I don't like Trump. I don't think now if Trump does something that is flat out against the Bible, I would say, yeah, absolutely, call that guy out. But I don't see the other side doing anything any different. So I just think we got to be careful on this. Dante, what do you think on this?
I think we do. I think, as Christians, it's really hard to try to be political, yet, we're taught to be in society, to live in society, to be ambassadors for Jesus Christ. And does that preclude that I can't be a fireman, I can't be a policeman, I can't be a soldier, I can't be a commodity broker, I can't be a senator, a House of Representative? No, it means I can. And by which the God-given rights that I've been, especially in the laws of this land, can promote me or elevate me to these levels, regardless of background, regardless of how we've been brought up. And even to the point, civil rights, looking at, Abe Lincoln and some of the things that he said, and even going back to Washington, some of these presidents where slavery was real, and getting out of England and declaring our independence and going through, what we needed to do. I think realizing, as I said in the beginning of this first half of the podcast, our inalienable rights, and that all men were created equal. I think inherently our founding fathers, and some of them, we can get into the antics or the semantics of what they owned or the property and all that, right or wrong. But the reality of it is they knew, our founding fathers knew, and the majority of them had a relationship of the knowledge of the Savior, Jesus Christ. And they knew that men were created equal. And they knew that this document, this Constitution that they created for men was flawed in so many different ways, but it was a living document that was meant to be, changed as we progressed and as we move further into knowledge and understanding. And the idea and the hope was that there would be life, there would be liberty, there would be pursuit of happiness for each and every individual. So when we look at that, dear brother, dear sister, in Christ, please, let's get off of our soapbox of, because I'm blue, red, or indifferent, it's going to separate us and we have to automatically be imposed. And please be open to listening to those that are in opposition of your personal beliefs. Have a conversation with them. I don't care, even if it gets to the point that it's heated, get heated. But at the end, look at that person and just say, thank you. You know what? And you sit there and say, why should I thank that person? Thank that person that we're in a country that I can literally, Lance, hypothetically, you and I are on different sides, and I tick you off or I make you angry, that I have the thank you to that we can have these debates, we can have these dialogues, we can have these arguments and walk away not living in fear that the government that I live in certain societies, the secret police are going to come take me away from my family, my job, and for a year imprison me and torture me and then indoctrinate me to their beliefs. Thank God that I have the ability to have my freedom of rights that gives me that, and celebrate that in this country. And let's come together with our differences. And yes, there's a long way that we have to go as a nation, but don't automatically broad brush every sister and brother in one class or the other, because that's a sin. And that is trying to sit there and say that you are making God-like choices when you know that none of us should be in that role. There's only one creator, one maker, and we are there to magnify his glory and to share his good news through his son, Jesus Christ.
Yeah. And I would say that, I tell this to people over and over again. I'm like, I cannot do anything about the past. I can't change history. I can't change what people did in the past. I can empathize and I can understand that. I can understand that racism is an ugly, and slavery is an ugly part of our American history. I can absolutely empathize with that, but I can't change it. I can't do anything to change history. What I can do is I can change right now. And so I ask the question, what can I do right now? Is there laws? I ask people all the time, what laws do we have on the books right now that are blatantly racist laws? And if we have those laws, let's look at them and change them. Now, things like, as far as like crime reform or sentencing and I don't even know what I'm trying to call that. Imprisonment and reform in those areas, I think we could absolutely, there's probably some things we could look at in those areas. And I think some things that are labeled violent crimes are not necessarily violent crimes. But again, go back to look at who supported those crime bills. It's not the political party you think. It's actually probably the one that's on the side of the woke.
And one of them is a presidential candidate, by the way.
Exactly.
Not the current, not the current sitting president.
Yeah, exactly. So we have to look at all these things. But so what's the fix, guys? And I'm sorry, we get on these political rants. But let's talk about what the fix is, because there is a fix to this. Psychology Today did an article and some research stating that there is there's a gap in our capacity to think critically. And we've talked about this in this podcast numerous times, that we are raising kids today who are not able to think critically. And we also have failures of empathy that puts walls between us. And just exactly what you're talking about. When we can't empathize with the other side and have an honest debate and discussion, when your first approach is, I want to censor or I want to scream and yell at somebody who says something I don't agree with, that's not empathy. That's not understanding, and that's not dialogue. And we have a huge failure of empathy within this country. Kids and adults are growing up today not learning and lacking self-awareness, self-regulation of their emotions, internal motivation, empathy, and social skills. Again, this is from Psychology Today. So America, in just a couple of generations, has actually produced a highly self-centered and unhappy population. So we have people are more and more self-centered. They care less about other people. And surprisingly, there are high rates of anxiety, depression, and suicide. And also, according to Psychology Today, this large population of self-centeredness has also led to a lot of cognitive distortions and biases. So thinking and ideology, what we talked about in part one, things that aren't necessarily true, but because of their emotional state or their mental health state, they kind of buy into some of these cognitive distortions and biases. So self-centeredness can also channel an individual's frustrations and dissatisfactions into blame, hatred, hostility, racism, and other forms of bias. So rather than saying, maybe I have some part to play in this, I'm going to blame a scapegoat. I'm going to blame the system. I'm going to blame another race. I'm going to blame a political party. I'm going to blame a president. And then at the extreme measure of this leads to hatred, hostility, racism, even violence. And what we talked about in part one of this podcast, where people who are supposedly, the most tolerant, open, loving people are out there punching and hitting people with deadly weapons. So you have to be aware of this. And Dante, you've talked about this love of self many times in this podcast. What do you think on this, of what Psychology Today is saying?
I think the reality of it comes down to it's sin. It comes down to, I deserve this. I deserve a break today. It's all about what I need to please.
It's me.
Yeah. Me, and it's almost like culture and society and pleasure is creating this godlike syndrome that we need to elevate ourselves above everybody else. And the reality of it is there's brokenness. And the reality of it is, there's inherently a breakdown in, what God intended between man and woman. And that's a family. And you look at and not just to pick on one background or another, but when a family lacks, a father in the house, somebody that is going to nurture and instruct and be with his child, or a father figure or a mentor, a lot of times, you can look at stats that are, not religious based, are actual psychologically based and, or, CIA data or just historical data in the medical field. And the propensity by which these individuals that lack a father in the house of their chances of ending up in prison, in violence or in criminal activity is astounding. And the reality of it is, when we look at these facts, each and every one of us needs to be brokenhearted and sit there and say, this is something that a country as free as ours should never have again. And to just broad brush it and just let's throw everybody in prison for a minor infraction of having drugs in their pocket or petty theft or something like that. And I'm not sitting there, I'm not this flaming lib to sit there and say, let everybody out. But, even recent, executive order made by our U.S. president that got a lot of minority support and background, and just getting rid of stupid laws of imprisonment to people and letting them out, and the idea of just helping these people get a leg up. And, I go back to our podcast with Jamie, him and I are political opposite in most arguments, but, some of the things that he said, some of the things that he resonates with me, is as a society, of our lesser, the least of these, the chain gets stronger when we bring the weakest link up. And these Jim Crow laws that were brought up, like you said, by a party, these racial acts, these different cultures that have come by a specific party that, are a party of hate, are a party of discord, and likewise the other party that, is supposed to be free, of financial responsibility and all this other stuff, somewhere together, we've got to say enough of bipartisanship and come together and say, how do we lift our brother and sister? And what is a way that we can do? Now, they're simple things, but all this getting back to like your question, Lance, on this is, yes, it comes down to this godlike syndrome, small g, that I am the god of selfism and that I deserve everything at the expense of everybody else around me. Lance, moving it on, In politics, we've seen a polarization lead to disdain and indifference and increases in using dehumanizing language, by politicians, by constituents, even by, high media profile or Hollywood profiles that describe their opponents. You'll remember in one of our previous podcasts, we talked about Brené Brown and how dehumanizing language was a start of every major atrocity of the 20th century. Empathy and compassion, Lance, does not require laws or that a society sacrifice its own well-being for the betterment of strangers, but it does require an intelligent assessment of what is happening internally and around the world. If we look at this, a minimal level of humane values and irrational attempts to apply those values, part of being, in a situation of the United States is respecting the rights of others, even if they differ from yours, and not trying to infringe on the rights of others just because you disagree with their opinion. If we look at, because of this disdain and indifference, we've seen increases in the calls for censorship, even at American universities, which is just a moral outcry of that's wrong. And some of these institutions that were back in protest of wars and sitting there saying, what's right, what's not, and how much they would die to protect freedom of speech, are now, being advocates for censorship and using the government to force people to think and act in certain ways. This is the exact tyranny our founding fathers warned against, and the reasons why we declared our independence from a king who wanted to tax us without representation, who wanted to instill on us things that were not equality, as each and every one of us had in our individual rights.
Yeah,
Lance, what do you say on this?
So let's get into what are some practical ways as a parent, as a dad, as a husband, father, how do we develop these positive empathy and compassion skills at our home? And I'll tell you, so the number one way that we would say to do this, not necessarily in any order, but just number one. So provide your children with the support they need to develop strong self-regulation skills. So we're talking about regulating their emotions. Children who are better at regulating their negative emotions tend to show greater empathy for others and concern. So this means acknowledging rather than dismissing negative feelings and engaging kids in conversation about the causes and effects of emotions. So Dante, we talked about this in, where don't tell your kids how to feel if they're having an emotion, even if it's a negative emotion. Talk to them about that. Why are you feeling this way? What is causing you to be upset right now? What is causing you to be sad right now? And having them talk about that, because when we dismiss their emotions, what we're teaching them is when somebody shows an emotion, you can just dismiss it and that'll get passed on. And then that's how they'll react with others. So this is, again, going back to that need to develop strong self-regulation skills in our kids of emotions. So what's the next one, Dante?
Number 2, understand how feelings of guilt and shame can affect a child's empathetic responses. We've talked about this before in podcasts. Please go back, look at our history, and just find that decades of research show that when we feel ashamed or feel targeted by shaming tactics, we don't usually respond in a constructive or a pro-social way. If we accept the shame, we tend to feel helpless. We withdraw or sulk. If we reject the shame directed at us, we tend to feel resentful and angry. Look at current political situations.
Yeah.
We double down, maybe even lash out. However, guilt and remorse are different than shame. When we feel guilty, we reflect on our bad choices, and most especially, we focus on the harm our mistakes have caused to others. As a result, feelings of guilt inspire us to respond constructively. We don't feel helpless. We don't feel resentful and angry, and we feel sad for the suffering of others, and we want to make things better. So if we want our kids to respond to these situations with empathy, we need to avoid feelings of shame. So if a child seems unrepentant or unfeeling, we shouldn't denounce him as bad or inherently evil. we shouldn't comfort him, or I'm sorry, we shouldn't confront him in a way that makes him feel threatened or humiliated, or her threatened or humiliated. Instead, we should call their attention to the consequences of their behavior. Talk with them about how the other person is feeling and help them find ways to make amends. Does that make sense to you, Lance?
Yeah, and we kind of talked about that in our podcast on high control parenting a few weeks back. You can listen to that, and I'd highly recommend if you want to understand this discipline. There's a great book by Karis Kimmel Murray. I think so it's Karis Kimmel. It's Tim Kimmel's daughter, but I think her married name is Murray. But she did a book called Grace-Based Discipline, which kind of talks about this, where discipline that's focused not on guilt and shame, but on not on the shaming tactics, but on how to get a child feel the remorse and empathy for what they did in that situation. So I'd recommend that to you. So the next step, number 3, is that we need to seize everyday opportunities to switch on your child's empathy mode. And we talked about this in podcasts as well, about just looking at everyday opportunities for a lot of different things, but we can also do this with our child's empathy. So research suggests that from infancy, and I've talked about this with my wife, from even as early as infancy, kids display a capacity for empathy, but it needs to be developed. So how do we encourage a child to practice empathy? Well, strangely, it's by a simple question. So asking kids to reflect on what other people are feeling can make a huge difference. So there was a Dutch study done from my forefathers where they asked kids 2 questions. They said, they said basically, will you help someone stay after class and clean up? Now, half the kids were told that this person was their friend, and the other half was told this person was not their friend. Now, not surprising, the kids offered to help their friend, but they said no, they're not going to help their person that wasn't their friend. But then the research asked the kids to think about how sad that person that wasn't their friend would feel if nobody helped them. And after introducing this simple question of empathy, the children showed no bias in favor of the friend or the non-friend. They were equally likely to say they would help a friend or a non-friend. So simply finding ways to ask, my wife was really good at this, asking our kids, saying, how do you think they feel? You took their toy away. How do you think they feel? Look at them. They're crying. They're upset. You made them feel that way. Why did, just having kids reflect on their actions, and that their actions can cause, other people to be upset. They to have that empathy and understanding that I can't just act however I want to act. And that's just a simple way of teaching kids that they can, how to have empathy. Dante, what's our next one?
Next one is number 4, help children discover what they have in common with other people. Adults tend to feel greater empathy for an individual when they perceive the individual to be similar or somehow related to them. They also find it easier to empathize with someone who is familiar. One of the best ways to encourage empathy is to make children conscious of what they have in common with others. This is why it's important to associate and socialize with people from different races, ethnicities, backgrounds, etc. I mean, Lance, when I look about it, you have traveled the world abroad many times. One thing I'm thankful for in the career that I've been able to travel the world abroad. I've been to Europe. I've been to Africa. I've been to South America. I've been to Asia. And I've seen poverty in places that I never knew could be as bad as it is. I've seen governments that know the limitations that they have, in even saying that no matter what we do, we can't stop it. And so the reality of it is, what it did for me, and even in some of these, charities that we go to and missions that we go to, I think it's really important for us to put this in perspective, to see how other people function, not only just in the way that they're content, but in the things that they struggle with, and genocides, and all that, and just the different cultural, and to get a better perspective of we're not the only, town or the only country in this world that, we're all in this together, and that, we have different tongues, different tribes, but the reality of it is, I think differences in each and every one of us is what makes us each special, and that has given us a way that we can commingle together in a way to bring God glory. All that being said, I mean, I don't want to minimize this. I want to sit there and say, when you look at the familiarity and the similarity that we have, even different tongue, different tribe, different culture, different ethnicity, there's a common theme that you see. And Lance, unless, you've seen it too, we've talked about it, but until you truly go out there and experience it, if you haven't, go to places that make you uncomfortable, go to that neighborhood that you never thought you would, and spend a time, get into a relationship with somebody, not being afraid to have a conversation, be wise, discern, but do it with a heart of understanding, and see how people perceive to that, but also into your understanding. Does that make sense, Lance?
Yeah, and I would argue on that, Dante, too. If you look around your church and you don't have a multi-ethnic church, I would ask, why don't you? Is your church not welcoming of different backgrounds and different people? And I remember, one of the churches we belonged to, at one point we had like 20 some different countries represented, at our church. And, when I look at, if you don't want to know a healthy church, if you look out in the audience and you see all different, shades and colors and ethnicities and backgrounds and genders and things like that. I mean, that to me that's a healthy church. If your church is all the same people with all the same beliefs and all the same thoughts, and then maybe you got an issue there. I mean, look at that. And I would challenge you then that if you're raising your kids in that environment, your kids, they need to, like you said, Dante, they need to go out and experience some diversity, and different cultures and different races and backgrounds and different countries and different religions, even, exposing them to that. So they can have that empathy and realize these people aren't the enemy. They're not, they're not, whatever, they are, but they're realizing that, we are all children under one God, regardless of what we look like or where we came from or what our background is. So this last one,
next?
This last one I'm going to talk about here is that, we need to help our children develop a sense of morality that depends on internal self-control, not on external rewards and punishments. And Dante, this goes to, man, I could spend, podcasts talking about this, but, if our morals and our morality and our ethics comes from internal or from God, let's say it that way, then we're not likely to, adopt or morally disengage, as they call it, when it suits my purpose or my cause right here. If you're never going to see if somebody's a moral person, they are not going to go out and punch an elderly person in the face at a protest because they disagree with them. And I would say that. So what we need to do, if you've listened to this podcast, we've talked about this over and again, but we want our kids to be able to regulate themselves from the inside, not based on external factors or whatever the latest trending thing is on Twitter. And studies suggest that kids are more likely to develop an internal sense of right and wrong if their parents use what's called inductive discipline. So this is an emphasis or an approach that emphasizes rational explanations and moral consequences, not arbitrary rules and heavy-handed punishments. And we've talked about that. We talked about that in our high control parenting, and you've talked about it on multiple times, Dante, that the discipline or the consequences need to fit the crime. Certain things that are, if it's not moral, don't try to make them moral. But if it isn't a moral thing, then there should be consequences for that. So I'll give you, for instance, kids are more likely to internalize moral principles when their parents talk to them about how acts of wrongdoing affect other people. And this goes back to that empathy piece of saying, like, well, if you act in a certain way, how do you think that affects that other person? If you go and you scream in somebody's face, how is that showing them respect? And how is that having empathy for maybe what they are feeling or for what their side of the story may be? And I'll just cut this short, Dante, because we really talked about this in our podcast on high control parenting. I challenge you guys, you can go back and listen to that in how you really want to look at doing parenting, not this heavy handed, punishment based, stuff where it's more about psychological control and manipulation than it is about really focusing on changing the heart of a child from the inside. But with that, Dante, I'm going to turn it over to you for some final comments here.
Lance, that's really good stuff, and I really appreciate you sharing that with the listeners and with me. And, let's be honest, people, if we want to fix this nation, it starts with the heart and at home. Politicians, new laws and protests are not going to fix the heart issues. It has to start with you and I leading in the home. And, I want to wrap this around scripture, and I want to take us to 1 Peter 3:15. Here's the Apostle Peter, one of Jesus's disciples that has been with him through thick and thin, the good, when Jesus Christ asked him, who am I? Who do you, I know, what do others say? And, I know what others say, but who do you say I am? The good is Peter said, you are the Christ, you are the Son of God. The bad is, when Peter tried to instill his agenda of restoring, Israel to its rightful place. And, Jesus says, get behind me, Satan. I never knew you, depart, get away, get behind me, your will. And the ugly is after Jesus told him he's going to deny him, he did. And all this being said, goes back, Jesus, dies, crucified, rises again, and Peter meets him on the beach. And, Jesus says to them, unrecognized, throw the net over, and the fishermen who've been doing this all their life decide what the heck, and they throw it over. And, the Bible I love gives you specific of, I believe it's 143 fishes, which I can't wait to go back and research. What does that mean to the fishing nets at the time and all that? And, Peter realizing that it's Jesus, his Savior, who he denied, he did everything wrong based on his own will, his own kingdom, his own desire, swims back and God, ask him, the Son of God, 3 times, do you love me? Do you love me? Do you care for my people, feed my sheep, love my sheep? And after the 3rd time breaks Peter's heart, but he finally gets him on his mission. Peter, are you doing what I'm asking you to do? Are you doing my will, or are you still doing your will? And Peter finally gets it. And we read after that, Peter preaches, and 3,000, men, not to mention women and family, give their lives to the Lord. And he writes in 1 Peter 3:15 this, and I think it's appropriate to this podcast, Lance. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give you the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect, keeping a clear conscience, so that those who speak maliciously against your good behavior in Christ may be ashamed of their slander. For it is better, if it's God's will, to suffer for doing good than doing evil. I hope, between these 2 podcasts, part 1, part 2, how to fix this, is that we stop looking for reasons to blame everybody else and what's wrong, and start looking for reasons of how can we fix this, and what is our call to responsibility as legacy dads, legacy moms. And as Lance and I are going to tell you, it starts first and foremost with practicing what we preach and living that out in the home, and pointing these arrows that we call children, whether they're biological, adopted, foster cared, or spiritual sons and daughters, and shooting these arrows out into the world to give them the truth that we've been given to bestow upon them. And that's the hope that we have in Jesus Christ.
Amen, brother. And with that, guys, we want to say, as always, we thank you guys so much for your support. I know we got a little bit political in the last couple, but it's getting out of hand, and sometimes we just feel like we got to speak up and bring some levity to some of these issues. So we want to say thank you guys for your support. You can head over to Apple Podcasts, Pandora, and Spotify. If you want to subscribe, hit us up with a great 5-star review. If you want to talk more about this, or you got some thoughts and comments, hit us up on Instagram or the closed Facebook group. We love having some discussions on the stuff we've talked about in there. And if you disagree with us, that's fine too. We'll listen to you and we can have an honest discussion. That's what all this is about. So, as always, guys, we want to say we love you guys so much. We're praying for you guys. Take care. We'll see you next week, and God bless.
God bless.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Legacy Dads Podcast with Lance and Dante. Real men, authentic faith. For more great content and to stay up to date, visit legacydads.org and on Facebook.com/LegacyDads and on Twitter @Legacy_Dad. If you enjoyed today's episode, please review and subscribe, and we'll catch you next time on the Legacy Dads Podcast. Real men, authentic faith.